The knock came so soft he almost missed it. Callum Devrett had spent 38 years learning the sounds of Wyoming winters, and this one was angry. Wind clawed at the pine logs of his cabin like something that wanted in, not for warmth, but for destruction. Snow drove sideways across the valley floor, erasing the fence line, erasing the barn, erasing everything beyond 10 feet of cold gray air. The mountains had disappeared hours ago. The world had shrunk down to 4 walls, an iron stove, and the smell of wood smoke and old leather. He was working a piece of bridle strap by lamplight when the sound came. A knock. 2 of them. Soft and careful, like whoever stood on the other side of that door was not entirely sure they had the right to be there. Callum set down the leather and reached for the Winchester above the door. 38 Wyoming winters had taught him that trouble rarely announced itself with noise. The worst kind came quiet. He opened the door and the storm tried to take it from his hands. A woman stood on the porch. She was half buried in snow. Her wool dress, deep blue, had gone stiff with ice along the hem and sleeves. Her hair, which might have been a dark reddish brown under all that frost, was plastered flat against her face. Her lips had passed blue and were moving toward something closer to gray. One hand gripped a small carpet bag with the kind of force that had nothing to do with the weight of the bag and everything to do with the fact that it was the last solid thing she had left to hold on to. She did not beg. She did not cry. She looked at him with eyes the color of winter sage, steady and clear, despite the cold that should have taken the steadiness out of anyone, and she waited. Callum did not ask questions. He caught her by the arm and pulled her inside. The door slammed shut behind them. The screaming of the wind dropped to a low moan, held back by pine logs and mud chinking and 30 years of solid building. The lamp on the table threw yellow light across the floor. The stove ticked and breathed in the corner. The woman shook so hard her teeth rattled against each other, a sound like loose coins in a tin cup. "That dress," Callum said, already turning his back and moving toward the wooden peg where he kept a spare flannel shirt and his mother's old wool blanket. "Get it off. Wet clothes will kill you faster than the cold will." He kept his eyes on the stove while the sounds of frozen buttons and stiff fabric filled the room behind him. When the rustling stopped, he turned. She stood wrapped in his flannel shirt, which reached her knees. Her dress lay on the floor like shed skin. She looked smaller than she had in the doorway, though he was not sure that was possible. He handed her the wool blanket without speaking. She wrapped it around her shoulders and let him guide her to the chair closest to the stove, the one with the cracked leather seat that had held its shape from years of him sitting in it after long days. She sat down as though her legs had simply decided they were finished. He put coffee on, then soup, thick bean and pork from the pot that had been sitting low on the back of the stove since that morning. She drank the coffee first, both hands around the cup, eyes half closed. Then the soup, slowly at first, then steadier as color crept back into her face like dawn coming up over the eastern ridge, slow and then all at once. He watched her without appearing to watch her. It was a skill he had developed over years of living alone. You learn to take stock of things quietly. Clean hands, but not soft. There were calluses along the inside of her right palm, the kind you got from penwork and ledger pages, not from scrubbing floors. Straight spine, even now, even half frozen and wrapped in a blanket that smelled like wood shavings and old smoke. No tears. He noted that specifically. A woman who had just walked through a Wyoming blizzard with nowhere to go had not cried once since he opened the door. When the soup was gone, she set the bowl down carefully on the edge of the table, the way a person does when they have been raised to be mindful of other people's things. "Why are you here?" he asked. Her eyes came up to his, still steady, still clear. "A man named Harlan Voss brought me from Boston to be his wife," she said. Her voice was low and precise, an educated voice, the kind that came from schooling rather than circumstance. "He changed his mind at the station." Callum knew the name. Every rancher in the Sweetwater Valley knew the name. Harlan Voss owned the largest spread in the valley, 3,000 acres running east from the creek toward the rock formations they called the Sentinels. He ran cattle and he ran people, and he had a way of doing both that left marks. "He left you," Callum said. It was not a question. At the crossroads past Laramie, he gave me coach fare and a paper saying the agreement was ended. She reached into the carpet bag, which she had kept on her lap through all of it, and produced a folded sheet. The paper was good quality, the ink dark and deliberate. She set it on the table and pushed it toward him. He read it without picking it up. Agreement terminated due to unsuitability for ranch requirements. Below that, Harlan Voss's signature, bold, unapologetic. Callum looked up at her. "You walked 3 miles in this." There was nowhere else to go. Her jaw was set in a particular way that told him this was not self-pity. It was simply the truth, stated plainly, because plain truth was what the situation called for. "The hotel wanted payment in advance. The money he gave me was enough for the coach or the room. Not both. Outside, a gust hit the cabin hard enough to shift something on the roof. Snow hissed against the window glass. The lamp flame shuddered inside its glass chimney and steadied. "You can stay until the storm breaks," Callum said. He pulled his chair out from the table and sat down across from her. "Name's Callum Devrett." Maren Donahue. She glanced around the cabin then, a careful survey. 1 room, a bed in the far corner with a plain wool blanket, tucked tight. Tools arranged on pegs along the east wall with the kind of order that came from daily habit rather than company manners. A shelf above the table holding a Bible, a tin of salt, a small jar of dried herbs someone had tied with string. And on the second shelf, the one at eye level from where she sat, a pair of small shoes. Children's shoes. Red leather. Once bright, now faded and soft with age. They sat alone on the shelf with the particular stillness of objects that have not been moved in a very long time. She looked at them for exactly 1 second. Then she looked away. "I can work," she said. Her voice did not change. "Cook, clean, keep accounts. I won't be a burden." "Nobody said anything about burden," Callum replied. "Storm like this, you give shelter. That's just what you do." She studied him then, openly, the way a person does when they are deciding whether something is true or whether it is performance. Whatever she found in his face seemed to satisfy her. She looked back at the stove. They sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Outside, the storm pressed and howled. Inside, the fire breathed and the lamp burned steady and the soup pot steamed softly on the back of the stove. Later, when the fire had burned lower and the worst of her shaking had stopped, she spoke again. "You're not asking why he sent me away." Callum was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands, watching the lamp rather than her. "Harlan Voss doesn't do anything without a calculation behind it," he said. "A woman comes all the way from Boston, answers every letter he wrote, gets on a train. He takes one look at her at the station and sends her away in a blizzard. He set the cup down. That's not about suitability. The words sat between them like a stone dropped into still water. You think I'm pretty? She asked quietly. I think you're alive, he said. Tonight, that's the thing that matters. She slept in his bed that night, wrapped in his mother's quilt. He took the floor with the buffalo robe and a folded saddle blanket for a pillow. He did not mind it. He had slept on worse ground in worse weather and felt less troubled about it. He woke before dawn, stoked the stove, started biscuits and coffee. When he heard the rustling from the bed that meant she was waking, he kept his back turned and let her have the moment of collecting herself in private. There was a dignity to allowing people that, something his mother had taught him when he was small, without ever using the word dignity to describe it. The storm had not broken. If anything, it had settled in, the way Wyoming blizzards sometimes did, like a guest who had decided they were comfortable and intended to stay. Roads will be buried for days, he said when she came to the table. She sat down, accepted the coffee he set in front of her. I should go as soon as it's passable. You should eat first. He put the biscuits between them. Then we'll see what the weather's doing. They ate. She cleared the plates afterward, quietly, without being asked. He watched her move around the small space and noticed that she had already figured out where things lived. The dishcloth, the water bucket, the hook where the pot hung. She noticed things and filed them without making a production of it. He went out to the barn in the deep cold of that morning, breaking ice from the water troughs, forking hay to the cattle, checking the young heifer who had been looking heavy for a week. When he came back inside, stamping snow from his boots on the porch, he saw through the window that Maren had found the account ledger. It was sitting on the table where he had left it, but she had it open and was turning pages slowly, her finger running down columns of figures with the focused attention of someone reading a language they know well. She was not snooping. She was reading numbers the way a person who understands numbers cannot help but read them, the way he could not pass a fence line without checking the tension of the wire. He came inside. She looked up without embarrassment. Your winter tallies, she said. The feed costs from October don't match the weights you've recorded for the herd. He sat down across from her. I know. You're losing somewhere. I know that too. She looked at him for a moment, then back at the ledger. Her finger moved to a different column. May I? She asked, and reached for the pen in the tin cup by the lamp without quite waiting for his answer. He almost said something. Instead, he watched her begin to work through the numbers, quietly, methodically, her pen moving with the ease of long practice. Her handwriting was very small and very clean. Something shifted in the room that he did not have a word for. The storm locked them in for 3 days. On the second morning, she put a stack of letters on the table between them. Harlan's letters, she explained, written over 2 months. He read them because she handed them to him and because she sat across from him clearly wanting him to understand something she did not know how to say out loud yet. The letters were good, well composed, thoughtful, specific. They described the ranch and the valley and the work of frontier life with enough honest detail to be believable and enough warmth to be appealing. They spoke of partnership and respect. They spoke of a woman who could read and write and keep accounts as an asset, a word he noticed and suspected Maren had noticed too. They promised a proper wedding in spring, and a home that was solid, if not grand. Then Harlan had taken one look at her at the Laramie station and handed her a piece of paper. He asked specifically for a woman who could keep accounts, Callum said, setting the last letter down. Yes. Then he sent you away? Yes. He sat with that. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees on the ridge above the cabin, a sound like breathing. You sold things to come, he said. It was not a question. He had read it in the way she held the carpet bag, in the careful way she wore that patched blue dress, the one that was her best and had been mended so many times the stitching had become its own kind of pattern. Her hands were still on the table. My mother's wedding ring, she said. Her books. A small piano that had been in the family since before I was born. He wanted to offer comfort. He did not know how to do it in soft words without it feeling like a diminishment of what she had lost. So he said the only true thing he could find. You took a chance, he said. That's not foolish. That's courage. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the letters on the table. That afternoon, he handed her a piece of pine and his carving knife, and showed her what he had been working on in the evenings. A spoon, rough still, just finding its shape under the blade. She watched his hands without speaking. When he offered her the knife and the wood, she took them carefully and tried the motion he had shown her, tentative at first, then with more confidence as the wood began to yield. For your coffee, he said, when the shape had emerged enough to be recognizable. She ran her thumb along the curve of the bowl. The wood was pale and smooth where the knife had touched it. Different kinds of beauty, she said quietly, almost to herself. Different kinds of useful, he replied. On the fourth morning, the sky came up clear and hard and blue, the particular blue that Wyoming produces after a hard storm, like a compensation for what it has just put you through. The roads would be passable, not easy, not comfortable, but passable. Callum went to the desk. He took the letter out of the drawer and held it for a moment in the morning light. Harlan's letter. The one that had arrived 3 weeks before Maren Donahue had knocked on his door. The one with her name and address and the date of the train. He thought about what it meant. He thought about Harlan sitting in his big house past the Sentinels, writing to Callum with the offhand casualness of a man sharing information he considered harmless. Harlan had not thought Callum would do anything with it. Harlan had not thought Callum was the kind of man who would take in a woman turned out in a blizzard and keep her safe until she could decide what she wanted to do next. That was the thing about Harlan Voss. He calculated everything, and he was right about numbers, and he was wrong about people, and he had never understood that those were not the same kind of right. Callum folded the letter. He put it in his shirt pocket. He would tell her. Not yet. But he would tell her. She deserved to know everything, and she would know it when he had worked out the shape of what he wanted to say. He went outside to split the morning wood. He was halfway through the third log when Maren appeared on the porch, wrapped in his heavy coat, her dark hair loose down her back. She was holding something in her hand. He straightened and looked. She was holding a second ledger, not his. Smaller, thinner, with a different cover, the kind that came from an office supply rather than a general store. Where did you find that? He asked. In the bottom of the chest under the window, she said. I was looking for an extra pen. Callum. She said his name carefully, the first time she had used it without the slight hesitation that comes from politeness about a name you have not yet earned permission to use. This is not your ledger. He came up the porch steps and took the book from her. He opened it. The handwriting was not his. The figures were not his ranch, not his cattle counts, not his hay tallies, but the name at the top of the first column page was a name he recognized because it appeared alongside his own name at the bottom of a land agreement he had signed in the spring of 1880, 3 weeks after he had buried his wife and daughter behind the cottonwood tree, in the worst month of his life, when a man had come to him with papers and a reasonable voice, and an offer that had seemed, at the time, like one less thing to think about. Harlan Voss's name. And below it, in numbers that were precise and organized and absolutely clear in what they showed, was a record of every transaction Harlan had conducted along Sweetwater Creek in the past 4 years. Property valuations, transfer prices, dates. Maren tapped the second to last page. "This parcel," she said, pointing to a lot number. "Do you know what this is?" He looked at the number. His chest tightened. "That's the strip of land along the east bank of the creek," he said. "I signed it over to Voss in 1880 for $200. "And this," she said, moving her finger to the column beside the lot number, "is what that same strip of land is expected to sell for when the railroad comes through next year." She looked up at him. "Callum, this figure is not $200. The number she pointed to had 4 digits, followed by another. The morning air was very cold and very still. A jay called somewhere in the pines above the cabin, sharp and indifferent. "He knew," Callum said. It was not a question. It was a thing becoming real in his mind. The slow turn of something he should have understood years ago, clicking into its actual position. "He knew about the railroad when he made me that offer." "The dates in this ledger go back to 1879, Maren said quietly. "He was tracking the railroad survey routes a full year before he approached you." Callum stood very still. The wood axe was still in his right hand. He became aware of it and set it down against the porch rail with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with care for the axe and everything to do with needing something to do with his hands that was not what his hands wanted to do. "There's more," Maren said. She turned to the last page. He looked at what she was showing him. His own signature, or something that was meant to be read as his signature, at the bottom of an addendum. A second parcel along the creek. Land that, as far as Callum had ever known, he still owned outright. Land that had never been part of any agreement he had made with anyone. The signature was not his. He knew his own name well enough to know that. "When did you find this?" he asked. "Yesterday morning," she said. "I wasn't certain until I compared it with your signature in the ranch ledger. The hand is close, but not close enough. Whoever copied it was working from a letter rather than from watching you sign in person." She folded her hands in front of her, a gesture of precision, of someone presenting a case carefully because the case matters. "Callum, he didn't just buy your land when you were grieving. He has been taking more of it, quietly, on paper, with a signature that is not yours, for 2 years. The blue sky above the valley was enormous and cold and indifferent. The creek, half frozen, ran its quiet course through the white meadow below the cabin. Somewhere past the sentinels, in his big house, Harlan Voss was making his calculations. Callum looked at the book in his hands. Then he looked at the woman standing on his porch in his coat, with her straight spine and her steady eyes, and her absolute inability to walk past a set of numbers that did not tell the truth. "You weren't meant to find this," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't imagine I was." The jay called again in the pines. The creek ran under its ice. The morning held itself still around them. "I have to think," Callum said. "I know." Maren took the ledger back from him and held it against her chest. Take your time. But Callum. She waited until he looked at her directly. This doesn't go back in the chest. No, he said. It doesn't. He went back to the wood. She went back inside. He swung the axe, and the cold air took the sound and carried it down the valley, and he worked through the pile with the focused violence of a man who has just understood something he cannot unfeel, and needs to put the understanding somewhere his body can reach it before his mind tries to make it smaller than it is. When he came back inside an hour later, the ledger was on the table, and Maren was sitting across from it with her own smaller notebook and a pen, and she was already building the kind of organized, documented case that a person builds when they have spent years working in a law office, and they know what a court of law requires, and they intend to provide exactly that. She did not look up when he came in. Sit down, she said. I need you to go through everything you remember about the 1880 agreement, every detail, every conversation, everything Voss said to you before you signed. He sat down. He took the cup of coffee she had left at his place. He started to talk. She wrote. Outside, the sun moved across the white valley, and the shadows of the pine trees stretched long and thin across the snow. And the warmth inside the cabin was not only from the stove. That evening the cold came down again, but less violently than before. Callum sat by the fire with a piece of pine and his carving knife and worked in silence. Across the table, Maren had set aside the ledgers and taken up the mending she had asked permission to do with a tear in one of his work shirts. The kind of small, useful task she reached for at the end of the day the way some people reach for a book. See, he looked up at her once and found her looking at him. Not at the shirt, at him. She looked back down immediately, and the needle went through the fabric again, and neither of them said anything. He kept carving. The fire breathed. The lamp burned. The valley lay silent in the cold outside. And then the sound came. Not a knock. A thud, heavy and deliberate, against the side of the cabin. Then another. Then silence. Callum was at the door in 3 steps, Winchester in hand. He went out onto the porch. The chicken coop was standing. The barn was dark and quiet. Nothing moved in the blue-white, moonlit snow around the cabin. But on the porch, laid across the top step with deliberate neatness, was a folded piece of paper, weighted with a stone. He brought it inside and opened it under the lamp. The writing was not Harlan's. Someone else's hand, rougher, less educated. But the message was clear enough. Sell the land and go, or the woman does not get back to Boston. Callum read it twice. Then he set it face down on the table. Maren had come to stand beside him. He turned the paper over so she could read it. He watched her face while she did. Her jaw tightened. The needle in her hand did not move. She read it once, and then she set it back down, and she lifted her eyes to the window, to the dark valley and the moonlit snow and whatever was out there in it, and she stood very still for a long moment. Then she said, "He's afraid." Callum looked at her. "Harlan Voss doesn't threaten people he isn't afraid of," she said. "He simply removes them. The fact that he's sending notes means the ledger matters more than he wants us to know." She looked at Callum steadily. "We have something he needs to take back." Callum held her gaze. Outside, the moonlight lay cold and vast across the valley, and somewhere past the sentinels, a man was calculating his next move. And inside this cabin, a woman stood with her spine straight and her eyes clear and absolutely no intention of going back to Boston. "All right," Callum said quietly. "All right," she agreed. Neither of them slept much that night. Harlan Voss did not knock. He pulled his gray gelding up short of the porch and sat in the saddle the way powerful men always sit, as though the ground itself was something they owned and were merely allowing others to stand on temporarily. Sheriff Decker reined in beside him, a quiet man with a weathered face and the careful eyes of someone who had learned to wait before he formed an opinion. Two hired hands sat their horses a length behind, saying nothing, looking at nothing in particular, the way men do when they are paid to be present rather than to think. Maren had heard the horses. She set the coffee pot down without being told and turned toward the door, and when Callum opened it and stepped onto the porch, she came and stood behind him in the doorway, not sheltering behind him, standing beside him, or as close to beside as the width of the doorframe would allow. He noticed that. "Devrett," Harlan said, his voice carried across the cold air without effort, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. He was somewhere past 50, broad through the chest, with a face that might have been handsome once and had hardened into something more like a tool. His coat was good wool, dark charcoal, and his gloves were leather-lined with something soft. He had the look of a man who had not been cold in a very long time, not because the cold had left Wyoming, but because Harlan Voss had arranged things so that it did not touch him. His eyes moved past Callum to Maren. "I've come for what's mine," he said. Maren moved. Not back, not sideways, but forward, stepping out of the doorway and onto the porch beside Callum, which put her between Harlan's gaze and the door. She reached into the pocket of the wool skirt she had changed back into that morning, still stiff at the hem from yesterday's ice, and produced the folded paper. She opened it. She read it aloud, every word, in a voice that did not waver once. When she finished, she folded it again and held it up so that Sheriff Decker could see the signature at the bottom. Decker walked his horse 2 steps closer. He read the paper from the saddle. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes settled into a position Harlan was not going to like. "Seems clear enough," Decker said. He said it the way a man says something he has already decided and is not going to be argued out of. Harlan's jaw moved. The calculation behind his eyes was visible for just a moment, quick and cold, before he smoothed it back into something more controlled. He looked at Callum. "She's staying here," he said. The words were arranged to sound like an accusation. "Of her own choosing," Callum said. Decker looked at Maren directly. "Anyone forcing you to stay on this property, Miss Donahue?" "No." "Anyone mistreating you?" "No." The silence that followed had a particular texture to it. The silence of a man who has played a card and watched it lose. Harlan sat very still in his saddle. His right hand rested on his thigh, and as Maren watched it, she saw the fingers move, just slightly, toward the leather of the holster at his hip. A reflex. He stopped it before it became anything more than that. Only she had been close enough to see it. "You'll regret this, Devrett." Harlan's voice was still even, still controlled, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. "You're welcome to leave any time," Callum said. Harlan held his gaze for a long moment. Then he turned the gray gelding without another word and rode back down the trail, his hired men falling in behind him. Sheriff Decker lingered a moment longer. He looked at Callum, then at Maren, then back at Callum with the expression of a man who is reserving his judgment, but is leaning in a particular direction. "Storm's cleared," Decker said. "Roads should be passable by tomorrow." He touched the brim of his hat to Maren and followed the others down the trail. They stood on the porch until the horses disappeared around the bend where the cottonwood trees grew thick along the creek bank. The cold pressed in around them. Maren's breath came out in small white clouds. Her hands, Callum noticed, were entirely still at her sides. "He'll make trouble," she said, not frightened, observing. "Let him," Callum said. They went back inside. The first warning came the next morning. A chicken, one of the 3 Callum kept for eggs, was found on the porch with its neck wrung, laid across the doorstep with a neatness that made the message unmistakable. It was not violence for its own sake. It was punctuation. Callum disposed of it without comment. Maren watched him from the window and said nothing either. But when he came back inside, she was sitting at the table with the ledger open and her pen in her hand, and she was working through the numbers with a focused attention that he recognized as a particular kind of anger, the kind that has learned to make itself useful rather than loud. The valley began to talk. These things traveled fast in small communities, always had. A woman from Boston, a terminated agreement, 3 nights in Callum Devrett's cabin. By the end of the first week after the storm, the story had made its way to every ranch and homestead along Sweetwater Creek, and it had been shaped and reshaped by each telling until the facts inside it were barely recognizable. Maren felt it when she went to the trading post for thread, the way a conversation stopped when she came through the door, the way Mrs. Alderton found somewhere else to look, the way the 2 women near the dry goods counter moved, almost imperceptibly, a half step to the side. She bought her thread and said good morning to the man behind the counter, and walked back to the wagon with her spine straight and her face composed, and her jaw set in that particular way Callum had come to recognize as her version of dignity under fire. He was waiting with the wagon. He did not ask her what had happened inside. He clicked the horses forward when she climbed up, and they rode the 3 miles back to the ranch in a silence that was not empty. It was full of things being understood without being spoken. That evening she put a stack of letters on the table between them. "His letters," she said. "All of them. I want you to read them." He read them slowly, taking his time with each one. The lamp burned low between them. Outside, an owl hunted along the tree line, its call coming through the cold air at irregular intervals. The letters were careful, intelligent work. Harlan had written about the valley with a specificity that suggested he had wanted her to feel she knew the place before she arrived. He had described the mountains in autumn, the way the aspens went gold along the upper ridges and the creek ran cold and clear over smooth stones. He had written about the work of the ranch without romanticizing it, which made his promises of partnership feel more credible rather than less. He had asked about her skills with accounts in a way that was direct without being transactional, or had appeared not to be. Callum set the last letter down. He asked specifically for a woman who could read and write and keep ranch accounts, he said. Yes, he made that clear in the second letter. And then he looked at you at the station and handed you that paper. Yes? Callum was quiet for a moment. The owl called again, closer now. The railroad is coming through the valley next year, he said. Land along Sweetwater Creek is going to be worth more in 18 months than it's worth today. Considerably more. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Married men hold different claim rights than single men in some of the newer land arrangements. A wife on record can matter when it comes to dispute resolution. Maren's eyes were steady on his face. She was already following where this was going. He needed a wife for a legal arrangement, Callum continued. Specifically, a wife who could manage documents and accounts, someone who could sign papers and understand what she was signing. Then something changed. The deal shifted. The wife became unnecessary, possibly inconvenient. He looked at her. You were never meant to be a partner. You were meant to be leverage. She was quiet for a long moment. The lamp flame moved in some small current of air and steadied again. I sold my mother's wedding ring, she said, not for the first time, but saying it differently now, not as grief, but as a kind of reckoning. She was placing the full weight of what had been done to her into accurate language. Her books, a piano that came across the Atlantic with my grandmother. Callum wanted to speak. He found he did not have the right words, the ones that would carry the weight of what the moment needed without collapsing under it. You are the most capable person in this valley, he said finally. Harlan Voss is going to spend the rest of his life not understanding what he threw away, and that is going to have to be enough. She looked at him for a long time after that. Something moved behind her eyes that he could not entirely read, but it did not look like pity, and it did not look like sadness, and those were the two things he had been most afraid of putting there. She closed the ledger and went to bed. He sat with the lamp for a long time after. The days found a shape. A rhythm made itself from necessity, the way rhythms always do when people share a small space and a common set of tasks. Maren rose before light and had the fire built up and the coffee started by the time Callum came in from the first barn check. He fed the stove while she stirred the oats. She swept while he hauled water. He split the morning wood while she worked through the account ledger, finding the places where the numbers did not agree, and building a cleaner picture of the ranch's actual standing, column by column, day by day. He noticed that she worked the way she did everything else, thoroughly, without commentary, finishing what she started. The corrections she made to the ledger were done in a separate column alongside his original figures so that he could see both and understand the difference. She did not erase his work. She built beside it. On the second morning after Harlan's visit, they walked to the barn together in the dark, carrying lanterns. The young heifer had finally gone into labor, restless and anxious, pacing the back corner of her stall. Maren held the lantern steady without being asked while Callum checked the animal, running practiced hands along her sides, reading what needed to be read. "She's close," he said. "Is she all right?" "She'll do." He straightened. "First calf. She's nervous about it." Maren looked at the heifer with an expression that was specific and careful, the look of someone who recognizes something without naming it. "What will you do with the calf?" "Keep it if it's a heifer. Sell it on if it's a bull, most likely." He paused. "She's a good animal. Strong line. The calf should be worth something either way." Maren tilted her head slightly. The lantern light moved across her face. "You could say she's beautiful," she said. "It wouldn't make the other things less true." He looked at her. Then he looked at the heifer. "She's beautiful," he said, "and she's worth something." Maren smiled. Not a performance of a smile, not the careful social expression she used at the trading post. A real one, brief and genuine, gone almost before it was fully there. But it had been there. It did something to the air in the barn that he did not examine too closely. That night, the cold dropped to a temperature that had nothing reasonable about it. The kind of cold that snapped iron and turned breath to ice before it cleared your lips. Even with the stove burning as hot as he dared push it, the cabin lost ground to the night in the small hours, the warmth retreating toward the center of the room and leaving the corners gray with chill. He heard her shaking from across the room, not the polite, contained shivering of before, but the deep, involuntary kind that the body does when it has stopped being subtle about what it needs. Callum lay in the dark for approximately 2 minutes before he gave up pretending he was going to stay on the floor. He dragged the buffalo robe to the bed and sat himself against the headboard, keeping to his side, arranging the robe across both of them with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man solving a practical problem, which was what it was. That was the only thing it was. Body heat, he said into the dark. It works better than pride. A pause. Then she shifted, pulling the quilt up, settling closer to the warmth of him without quite closing the distance, leaving several inches of cold air between them like a line they had both agreed on without discussing it. Within an hour, her shaking had stopped. Her breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep. He stayed awake longer. The wind had dropped and the night was very quiet. The particular quiet of deep cold, when even the animals in the barn have gone still. He was aware of the weight of her beside him in a way that was not about wanting, or not only about wanting, but about something older and more complicated. The awareness of another living person, the specific gravity of not being alone. He had forgotten what that felt like, or he had tried to. It turned out it was not the kind of thing you could actually forget. By the time the lamp burned down, she had turned in her sleep, and her head had come to rest lightly against his shoulder, the way a person moves toward warmth without meaning to. He did not move. He sat in the dark with his arm resting carefully at his side, and listened to the deep silence of the valley and let himself have the 5 minutes, just those 5, of something that felt dangerously close to peace. Then he went back to being careful. Tighter days followed. The valley's opinion of Maren Donahue had hardened, the way opinions harden in winter when there is no warmth to soften them. At the trading post, the silences around her had grown longer. A note arrived at the cabin addressed to Callum from Leland Burke, who owned the small spread between the Garrett place and the creek, suggesting in careful language that Callum's current domestic arrangement was making it difficult for certain neighbors to continue their business associations with the Devrett Ranch in good conscience. Callum read the note once and put it in the stove without showing it to Maren. She found out anyway. She found most things out eventually. She had the particular attentiveness of someone who had spent years working in a law office where information moved through rooms in the half-said and the carefully avoided as much as in the plainly stated. "Leland Burke sent you a letter," she said one evening, not looking up from the ledger. He did not ask how she knew. "Yes." "And?" "And I put it in the stove." She looked up then. Something passed across her face that was not quite a smile and was not quite gratitude, but was in the neighborhood of both. She looked back at the ledger. "Thank you," she said quietly. He went back to the bridle he was mending and did not say that it had not required thanks. That burning that letter had been the easiest decision he had made in 4 years. It was in those pressing days that he began to understand the shape of what was happening between them. Not the romantic notion of it, but the actual architecture, built from daily proximity and shared purpose and the particular knowledge that comes from watching someone work through difficulty without collapsing. He did not have clean language for it. He was not a man who had ever been easy with language for interior things. But he understood it the way he understood the structural soundness of a fence line or the reliability of a particular horse, from evidence accumulated over time until the conclusion was unavoidable. She was someone he trusted. He had not trusted anyone, not in the way that mattered, since 1880. The evening of the first major snowfall of December found them at the table after supper, the stove burning steadily, the lamp casting its yellow circle across the pine surface between them. Maren was working through the account of what she had found in Harlan's fraudulent ledger, arranging her notes into the kind of ordered sequence that would be legible to a court. She had explained this to Callum without being asked, simply narrating her work as she did it, which he had come to understand was her way of thinking out loud and also, perhaps, of letting him into the process, rather than simply presenting him with conclusions. "He'll know you're building a case," Callum said. "He already suspects it. The note about leaving Boston was proof of that." She turned a page. "But suspecting and knowing are different. By the time he knows, it will be too late for him to do anything that doesn't make it worse for him." He looked at her across the table. "You've done this before." "I worked in a law office for 4 years," she said. "I watched cases built and cases lost. The difference was usually documentation." She smoothed the page flat with one hand. "We have documentation." Outside, the new snow fell steadily, thickening the valley into silence. Inside, the lamp burned and the stove breathed, and a woman with a straight spine and careful hands was building the legal destruction of the most powerful man in Sweetwater Valley, one column of figures at a time. He went to the desk and opened the drawer and looked at the letter for a long time. He needed to tell her. He had been telling himself he was waiting for the right moment, but the truth was simpler and less comfortable than that. He was afraid that knowing he had kept it from her would change something between them that he did not want changed. He closed the drawer. Not yet. But the letter's weight in the drawer had begun to feel like something he was carrying. On a night in the 3rd week of December, with the moon full over the valley and the snow blue-white in its light, Callum sat by the fire after Maren had gone to sleep, and he thought about the year just ending and the year about to begin, and the particular stillness of a life that had been empty for 4 years and was no longer empty. He thought about Ruth. He did this deliberately, the way you press on a bruise to determine how much healing has occurred. He thought about her voice and her stubbornness and the way she had named their daughter after something that grows in hard ground. He thought about the morning he had come home to find the house already quiet, with a particular quiet that is different from ordinary quiet, that has a weight and a finality to it. He thought about all of that. And then he thought about Maren Donahue, asleep in his bed across the room, and he found, with a kind of careful astonishment, that the grief and this new thing did not cancel each other out. They occupied different rooms in him. Both were real. Neither diminished the other. He sat with that for a long time. The fire burned low. The moon moved across the window. The valley lay white and enormous and still. 3 nights later, Harlan's second warning came. Not a note this time. 3 of the fence posts along the north pasture were found pulled from the frozen ground and broken, the wires strung between them cut and coiled deliberately, left on the ground as signature. 2 cattle had wandered through the gap before Callum found it at first light. It took 3 hours to repair in the killing cold. Maren came out with coffee at the halfway point, walking the half-mile in Callum's spare coat and boots. And she did not say anything about the posts or the cut wire. She handed him the coffee and stood watching him work for a few minutes, and then walked back to the cabin, When he came in, his hands were numb and his jaw was set in the way it set when he was making calculations of his own. "He's trying to cost us time," Maren said. She had made soup. She put a bowl in front of him. "And patience. He wants us tired and angry." "It's working on the tired," Callum said. "Then we rest tonight and work smarter tomorrow." She sat down across from him. "The copies go to Laramie as soon as the road will take the wagon. I want them in Aldridge and Crane's hands before the new year." He looked at her. She had been in Wyoming for 6 weeks. She had been turned out into a blizzard by a man who had calculated her worth and found it insufficient. She was living in a single room with a stranger in a valley that had decided to believe the worst of her. And she was sitting at his table, making plans with the quiet precision of someone who has decided what she is doing and intends to do it. "All right," he said, "after the new year." She nodded. She picked up her spoon. Outside, the wind moved through the pines on the ridge, and the creek ran silent under its ice, and somewhere past the sentinels, a man was running calculations that no longer accounted for all the variables. He should have been afraid of that. He was not afraid of that. The days that followed had their own particular quality, the quality of a situation that has been decided but not yet settled, like the air after lightning when the thunder has not yet arrived. They worked. They ate. They sat by the stove in the evenings. The rhythm of it had become so natural that Callum sometimes lost track, in the middle of an ordinary task, of the fact that 6 weeks ago he had been alone. He thought about that sometimes, not with regret, with a kind of careful astonishment at how quickly the shape of a life can reorganize itself around a new presence when the presence is the right one. Maren had taken to walking the fence line with him on Sunday mornings, the one morning of the week when the work was lighter and the pace less urgent. They walked it in companionable quiet, Callum checking the wire and the posts, Maren watching the valley with the attention of someone still learning its particular geography. She asked questions that were specific and practical, not the generic questions of a visitor, but the questions of someone who intends to be somewhere for a long time and wants to understand it properly. What does that rock formation mean for weather coming from the north? How deep does the creek run at the bend past the cottonwoods in spring? Which neighbor runs cattle on the high ground, and does their fence line hold against drift snow? He answered each one directly, without the abbreviated manner he used with people who were asking out of polite interest. She was not asking out of polite interest. She was mapping the valley in her mind, building the detailed internal picture that a person builds when they are deciding to belong somewhere. He did not say this to her. He watched it happen and kept the observation to himself, the way he kept most things, and felt something settle further into place with each walk. One Sunday she stopped at the cottonwood grove by the creek, where the largest tree stood with its roots in the cold water and its bare winter branches reaching in all directions like something that has decided to take up as much space as the sky will allow. She put her hand on the bark, just briefly, the way you touch something to confirm it is real. "Ruth and Nora," she said quietly. Not a question. She had understood without being told where the graves were. "Behind the tree," he said. "On the high side of the bank." She nodded. She did not say she was sorry, because they had already moved past the place where sorry was the right word for it. She stood with her hand on the bark for another moment, and then took it away, and they walked on. He understood that she had been paying her respects. He understood it as the gesture it was, quiet and deliberate and entirely her own, and he was grateful for it in a way he did not have language to express. They walked back to the cabin in the thin winter sunlight, and she made coffee. And he checked the stove. And the day continued, as days do when they are ordinary and full and enough. The last week of December brought a new development that neither of them had anticipated. A letter arrived from Leland Burke, the same neighbor who had written to Callum earlier, but this time addressed to Maren directly. The contents were brief and not kind. Burke had heard from Harlan Voss that the woman staying at the Devrett place had been dismissed from her position in Boston under circumstances that reflected poorly on her character. He included enough detail to suggest that Harlan had been busy with the invention of history. Maren read it at the table. Her face did not change. She folded it. She put it in the stove. She picked up her pen and went back to the case she was building against Harlan Voss. Callum watched her do this. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "He's trying to take away your standing before you can use it against him." "Yes," she said. "It won't work." She did not look up from the page. "The documents don't depend on my character. They depend on the figures, and the figures are what they are." He thought about the people in this valley who would read a letter like Burke's and decide to believe it, because believing it was easier than revising what they had already decided about a woman from Boston who had arrived in a storm and stayed. He thought about the particular vulnerability of a woman whose reputation is the only currency she has in a place that does not yet know her work. He went to the desk and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Leland Burke, brief and direct, stating that the allegations in his letter were fabricated and that Callum Devrett would stand behind the character of Maren Donahue without qualification. The second was to Tom Garrett, who had the most standing in the valley after Harlan Voss, and who had already shown himself willing to revise his opinion based on evidence. He did not tell Maren he was writing them. She found out 3 days later when Garrett came by, hat in hand, with an apology that was not for anything he had personally done, but for the general atmosphere of the valley, which he felt had not treated a capable woman fairly. Maren accepted the apology with the same straightforward courtesy she applied to everything, and then offered him coffee. When Garrett had gone, she looked at Callum across the table. "You wrote to him," she said. "Yes." "And to Burke." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't tell me." "No." He met her eyes. "I should have asked first. It was your reputation." She considered this. "Next time ask," she said. Then, after a pause, "But thank you." He nodded. She picked up her pen. The stove breathed. The night pressed in around the cabin, and the valley was dark and cold, and enormous outside. And inside the lamp burned steady and warm. It was enough. For now, it was entirely enough. The valley talked. It could not help itself. Small communities have always run on information the way engines run on steam. And the information moving through Sweetwater Valley that December was rich with the particular heat of a story that touches on money and loneliness, and a woman who had arrived in a storm and refused to leave. People added to it what they needed to add. They shaped it to fit what they already believed about men like Callum Devrett, and women who came from Boston, and men like Harlan Voss, who owned enough of the valley that his version of events carried weight simply by virtue of who was telling it. Maren felt it every time she went to town. She had learned to carry herself through it the way you carry yourself through cold water, steadily, without flinching, keeping your eyes on the other side. She bought what was needed at the trading post. She nodded to the women who nodded back, and did not acknowledge the ones who looked away. She loaded the wagon and drove home along the frozen creek road, and did not give the talk the satisfaction of changing her face. But she noticed everything. That was the thing about Maren Donahue. She noticed everything, and she filed it away, and she let it inform the picture she was building, quietly, methodically, the way she had always worked through a set of complicated figures. Patience was not passive. Patience was a strategy. Edith Granger was the first to break from the current of it. She was a widow, somewhere past 60, who had come to Wyoming from Ohio with her husband in 1861 and stayed after he died because, as she told anyone who asked, she had not crossed half a continent to turn around and go back. She ran a small homestead on the north side of the valley with the help of a hired hand named Perch, who was mostly silent and entirely reliable, and she had the particular authority of a woman who has outlived most of her reasons to be afraid of anything. She appeared at the cabin door on a Tuesday morning with a covered dish of cornbread and the expression of someone who has made a decision and is not interested in discussing it. "I heard you've been teaching at the church hall," she said to Maren, handing over the dish without preamble. "2 mornings a week. My granddaughter Nell is 8 and she can barely manage her letters. I'd like to bring her." "I'd be glad to have her," Maren said. Edith Granger looked at her for a moment with a thorough, unhurried assessment of a woman who has spent 60 years deciding who is worth her time. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. She turned and went back down the porch steps without further ceremony, climbed onto the seat of her small wagon, and drove back up the creek road. Callum was watching from the barn doorway. He came across the yard when the wagon had gone. "Edith Granger," he said. "That means something." "I gathered," Maren said. She looked down at the cornbread. It was still warm. She taught 2 mornings a week in the church hall. 4 children at first, then 6, then 9. She used what she had, the books she had carried from Boston, sheets of paper she bought at the trading post with the money Callum paid her for the account work, chalk on the small board Reverend Holt let her use. She taught letters and numbers and the basic architecture of a sentence. And she did it with the same precision she brought to everything, without condescension, without the particular sweetness that people sometimes use with children when they are really performing patience for an audience of adults. The children came back. That was the measure of it. Callum watched the change in the valley without commenting on it directly. He was not a man who narrated what he observed, but he noticed the way women who had been careful to look elsewhere at the trading post began to nod at Maren when she came in. He noticed that Edith Granger had started sitting in the front row of the church hall on teaching mornings, not to supervise, but to listen. He noticed that the cornbread had been followed by a jar of preserved plums and then by an offer from old Tom Garrett to lend his second plow horse if the spring ground turned hard. The valley was revising its opinion. Slowly, the way opinions change when they are built on observation rather than feeling. But it was happening. One evening, Callum came back from the north pasture later than usual, cold through to the bone, and stopped in the doorway of the cabin. Maren was at the stove. She was humming, almost inaudibly, something he did not recognize. A low melody that moved through the warm air of the room without making any demands on it. She had not heard the door open. She did not know he was there. He stood in the doorway for a long moment and did not go in. He had heard music in this cabin before. Ruth had sung while she worked, a habit she had brought from her family's home in Pennsylvania. Hymns mostly, and 1 or 2 old songs her grandmother had known. The sound of a woman's voice in a kitchen had been ordinary to him once, and then it had been gone, and the absence of it had become its own kind of presence. The way the space left by something removed becomes more defined than the thing itself had been. He had not understood until this moment how much of the silence of the past 4 years had been specifically that, not the absence of sound, the absence of that particular sound. He pushed the door open the rest of the way and came inside. Maren turned and the humming stopped, and she said good evening and handed him a cup of coffee, and he said thank you. And they moved around each other in the small kitchen space with the ease that had come from weeks of shared mornings and evenings, and neither of them mentioned what had just happened because there was no language available for it that did not ask more of the moment than the moment was ready to hold. But the sound had been there. He did not forget it. Reverend Holt came to the cabin on a Thursday, accompanied by Sheriff Decker. They sat at the table and accepted coffee and had the conversation that Maren and Callum had both known was coming, that they had perhaps been waiting for without quite admitting they were waiting for it. "The Valley is talking," Holt said. He was a mild man, genuinely kind, the sort of minister who was more interested in the condition of souls than in the performance of judgment. He said it without pleasure. "I want you to understand that I am not here to condemn anyone. I am here because I think it matters what happens next." "Harlan Voss is shaping the story," Decker said. He was more direct than the Reverend, as lawmen tend to be. "He's telling it in ways that are going to make things difficult for both of you. Marriage would close that door." Callum looked at Maren across the table. He had not looked at her quickly or with the glancing quality of a man checking how another person is receiving bad news. He looked at her directly, in the way he had been looking at her more frequently in recent weeks, as though she were a landscape he was still in the process of understanding. "I want you safe," he said. Maren set her coffee cup down. She looked at Holt, and then at Decker, and then at Callum, and her voice when she spoke was composed and entirely clear. "That is not what I asked." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was specific. Holt and Decker both had the good sense to let it be what it was. "If we marry," Callum said, and his voice had the particular weight of a man who is choosing words because they matter rather than because they are expected, "it will be because we choose it, not because Harlan Voss has made it necessary." Maren looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her eyes that she did not try to hide, though she did not try to name it either. "Then we wait," she said, "until we're ready." Holt nodded slowly. He looked at the two of them the way a man looks at something he has been asked to evaluate and has found more substantial than he anticipated. "I'll say what I can to quiet the talk," he said. "It won't silence Voss." "It doesn't need to," Maren said. "We'll manage Voss." They showed Holt and Decker out. When the wagon had gone down the road, they stood on the porch in the winter afternoon, and the valley lay white and still before them, and neither of them spoke for a long moment because the thing that had just been decided between them was large enough to require silence to settle into its proper shape. It was 2 weeks later that the boy came. His name was Danny Marsh, 17 years old, the youngest hand on the Garrett Ranch, and he came to the cabin in the early hours of a Sunday morning on a horse ridden nearly to nothing, hunched over the saddle with his face gray-white and his right arm held stiffly against his body. Maren heard the horse before Callum did. She was already lighting the lamp when he reached for the Winchester. They brought the boy inside. The arm had been gashed by a wire fence he had come down hard against when his horse spooked in the dark, and the cold had done what cold does when it gets into an open wound. The gash had gone 3 days without proper cleaning because Danny Marsh was 17 and believed, the way 17-year-old boys believe, that things will heal themselves if you give them long enough. The infection had other plans. Maren did not hesitate. She told Callum what she needed and he brought it, moving with the efficiency of a man who does not ask questions when the person giving direction knows more than he does. Hot water. The herbs she kept in a tin on the kitchen shelf, the ones she had brought from Boston because her mother had taught her that a woman alone in a new place should carry what she knows how to use. A clean cloth. The needle and thread from her sewing kit. She worked for 2 hours. Her hands were steady throughout. She spoke to the boy in a low, even voice, not to soothe him exactly, but to give him something outside the pain to fix his attention on, asking him about the Garrett Ranch, about his family in Cheyenne, about the name of the horse that had spooked. She kept him talking while she worked, and she did not let him see her face when the infection was worse than she had first understood, because a healer's face is information, and she chose carefully what information to share. Callum sat on the other side of the boy and held his good arm still when it needed to be still, and handed Maren what she asked for before she finished asking for it. By the time the sky began to lighten outside, Danny Marsh was sleeping, the arm cleaned and dressed, and the fever broken to something manageable. Maren washed her hands in the basin and dried them on the cloth, and stood at the window looking out at the pale gray of the early morning. Callum stood behind her. He did not speak immediately. "He'll be all right," she said. She already knew the question. "Yes," Callum said, "because of you." She turned from the window. She looked tired in the particular way that comes not from the body, but from the sustained effort of concentration and precision in a situation where error has consequences. Her hair had come partially loose, and she had not noticed or had not cared. There was a faint stain on her sleeve from the work. Callum looked at her and felt something shift in the arrangement of things he believed about himself and about what he was and was not capable of feeling. He looked away first. Danny Marsh stayed 2 days, sleeping mostly, eating the broth Maren made, and telling her, in the gradual and discursive way of someone recovering from something that frightened them, about his family and his plans, and the girl in Cheyenne he was trying to save enough money to get back to. Maren listened to all of it with genuine attention and did not treat any of it as small. When Tom Garrett came to collect the boy, he stood in the doorway of the cabin with his hat in his hands and looked at Maren for a moment before he spoke. "My wife wants to know," he said, "if she can bring the girls to your classes on Tuesdays." "I'd be glad to have them," Maren said. Tom Garrett nodded. He looked at Callum. Something passed between the two men that did not need words. That evening, Callum built the fire up high and they sat by it, the way they had fallen into the habit of sitting in the late hours, in the chairs on either side of the stove that had somehow become their respective chairs over the weeks without discussion. Maren was mending something. Callum was working the pine. He set the carving down. "Ruth liked to ride at dawn," he said. Maren's needle stopped. She did not look up immediately. She waited, understanding that this was not something he had built up to, but something he had arrived at, and that the way to receive it was quietly. She said the valley looked different in that light, like it was still deciding what it wanted to be. He looked at the fire. "She was right. It does." "What was she like?" Maren asked. She asked it the way you ask about someone who was real, not the way you ask when you're being careful about grief. "Stubborn," he said immediately. Then, with the quiet half-smile of a memory that still had warmth in it. Precise. She didn't use two words when one would do. She had opinions about things, and she stated them, and she didn't change them to make other people comfortable. He was quiet for a moment. She would have had opinions about Harlan Voss. I imagine she would have. She named our daughter Nora, he said. She said the name because anemones grow in hard ground. She wanted the girl to know from the beginning that growing in difficulty was not something to apologize for. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the night was deep and cold and still. She sounds like someone who knew things, Maren said. She did. He looked at his hands. I wasn't there when she died. I was moving cattle on the North Range, 3 days out. By the time the man Garrett sent reached me, it was already over. A pause. Both of them. Maren set her mending down. She did not try to soften it or reframe it or offer the consolations that people reach for when they want the discomfort of another person's grief to become manageable. She let it be what it was. You've been carrying that alone for 4 years, she said. Yes. Callum. She waited until he looked at her. It was not your fault that you were not there. He held her gaze. His jaw moved. He looked back at the fire, and she saw what it cost him to receive that simply, without deflection, and she did not press it further because she understood that some things can only be heard one word at a time, and the hearing of them takes longer than the saying. After a while, he stood and went outside. She heard his boots on the porch, the particular sound of a man who needs a moment of cold air and open sky to put himself back together. When he came back in, he went to the shelf where his mother's things were kept, the small items he had placed there years ago and not moved since. He took down the ring. It was a plain gold band, thin with age, the kind of ring that had been worn every day for a long time and had the look of something that belonged on a hand rather than on a shelf. He set it on the table between them. He did not pick up her hand. He did not make a speech. Not yet, he said. I'm not asking yet, but I want you to know it's there. When you're ready, if you're ready. Maren looked at the ring for a long time. The lamplight moved across the gold of it, and she looked at it the way you look at something that is asking you a question you need to be sure you are answering for the right reasons. When I put it on, she said quietly, it will be because I want to, not because I need to. He picked the ring back up and set it on the shelf, not where it had been, but closer to the lamp, where it would catch the light. Neither of them slept easily that night, but it was a different kind of wakefulness than before, less like watchfulness and more like the particular alertness of someone standing at the edge of something large, trying to understand the full dimensions of it before stepping forward. 3 days later, she showed him the rest. She had been building the case in her notebook for weeks, adding to it carefully, checking and rechecking the figures against the fraudulent ledger and against Callum's own records and against the land transfer documents she had found in the chest and in the desk drawer and in the rolled papers behind the wood box that Callum had kept because they seemed important but had not had the capacity to examine in the years of his worst grief. She laid it out on the table in the morning, after the chores and the coffee, in the clear winter light, with the same precision she had used to present the initial discovery. The forged signature alongside Callum's real signature in 3 different places, so the difference was impossible to mistake. The timeline of the railroad survey information Harlan had been tracking since 1879 against the dates of his land acquisitions. The current projected valuation of the creek parcels against what he had paid for them. The addendum with the false signature, the one that had transferred a second parcel Callum had never agreed to sell. Callum sat with it for a long time. He did not interrupt. He read everything she said in front of him slowly and thoroughly. "You've been doing this since the third day," he said. "Since the third day," she confirmed. "I needed to be certain before I said anything. Numbers can look like they mean something and turn out to mean something else. I wasn't going to bring you something I couldn't stand behind completely." He looked at the case she had assembled. It was thorough. It was documented. It was the kind of evidence that did not require anyone to take someone's word for anything. "There's a law firm in Cheyenne," she said, "Aldridge and Crane. I looked them up in the directory at the trading post. They handle land disputes and property fraud. If we send them copies of these documents with a summary of the timeline, they have enough to open a formal inquiry." Callum was quiet for a moment. "You've already written the summary." "I wrote a draft," she said. "I wanted you to read it before anything is sent." He picked up the pages she had set to the side of the table. He read them with the attention he gave to everything that mattered, which was complete and unhurried. When he finished, he set them down. "This is good work, Maren." "It's accurate work," she said. "That's the part that matters." He nodded slowly. He looked at the forged signature one more time, the one on the addendum, the one that was supposed to be his name and was close enough that it might have passed in a place where no one knew his hand. He thought about Harlan Voss in 1880, showing up at this cabin with his reasonable voice and his pre-calculated offer, knowing exactly what the land would be worth, knowing exactly that a man in grief is not a man making decisions with his full faculties available to him. "I want to send it," he said. "I'll make the copies today," Maren said. That night, 3 horses were found with the pasture gate open, tracks in the snow showing they had been let out deliberately. It took Callum until nearly midnight to find all 3 and get them back to the barn. When he came inside, Maren was at the table with the lamp turned up, and the copies were finished and stacked neatly, ready for the morning post at the Laramie office. The note was under the door when he went to bolt it for the night. He read it. He set it on the table without speaking and went to put another log on the fire. Maren read it. She set it face down. "He's escalating because he knows," she said. "The horses were a distraction. He wanted to see if the disruption would slow us down." "It didn't," Callum said. "No," she agreed. "It didn't." He came and stood at the window. The valley was dark and immense under the winter stars, the creek a faint silver line through the white meadow, the sentinels black against the sky to the east. Somewhere past them, Harlan Voss was working through his calculations, adjusting for variables he had not anticipated, revising a plan that had begun to encounter a kind of resistance he had not built into his figures. Because he had not accounted for her. That was the thing Callum understood now, standing at the window of his cabin in the cold dark of December 1883, that Harlan Voss had looked at Maren Donahue at the Laramie station and seen a refinement that disqualified her. And what he had actually been looking at was a precision that would undo him, and he had not had the wit to know the difference. "Tomorrow morning," Callum said, "those copies go to Laramie." "Yes," Maren said. He turned from the window. She was looking at him across the lamplit room, and the look between them was not the careful, measured thing it had been in the early weeks. It was something else now. Something that had grown from shared mornings and long evenings, and the specific intimacy of 2 people who have shown each other their worst fears and their most useful selves, and have not looked away. He crossed the room. He picked up the ring from the shelf where he had moved it closer to the lamp, and he held it for a moment, and he set it back down. Not yet, but close. Outside, the stars burned cold and clear above the valley, and the creek ran its patient course beneath the ice, and the night held everything in its enormous quiet, waiting, the way Wyoming nights always wait, for whatever was going to happen next. There were things between them now that had not been there in November. Not only the large things, the shared danger and the documented evidence and the decision to stay, but the small accretions of daily life that build the actual substance of closeness. The fact that he now knew she took her coffee without sugar, but with a full minute of warming her hands around the cup before she drank it. The fact that she now knew he checked the fire twice before sleeping, and that this was not anxiety, but habit. The habit of a man who has learned that vigilance is cheaper than loss. He knew that she woke quickly and fully, without the gradual emergence from sleep that most people required, as though some part of her had learned to stay alert even in rest. She knew that he moved through the cabin at night with the absolute silence of long practice, that he could cross from the bed to the stove and back without making a sound, and that he did this on the coldest nights to add wood without waking her. These were small things. They were also, Maren had come to understand, the vocabulary of a life shared with someone. Not the dramatic vocabulary of declaration and crisis, though there had been enough of both, but the quiet daily language of two people who have decided, without making a formal announcement of it, that the other person's comfort matters to them. She thought about this on the morning the copies went to Laramie, sitting in the wagon as the horses moved through the cold white silence of the valley road. She thought about what it meant to choose something, really choose it, with full knowledge of what you were choosing and what it would cost and what it might become. She had chosen badly once, or rather, she had not chosen at all, had responded to circumstance rather than exercising judgment, had mistaken the appearance of a good offer for the substance of one. Harlan Voss's letters had been a careful construction designed to appeal to exactly the kind of woman she was, and she had been too desperate and too hopeful to read them with the precision she would have brought to a legal document. She read everything with precision now. What she read in Callum Devrett was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, who expressed care through action rather than language, because language was not where he was most fluent, who had been broken by grief and had not pretended otherwise, and had not let the breaking define him beyond what it had actually done. A man who had kept a letter from her for weeks, not out of calculation, but out of the very human failure of not knowing how to begin a difficult conversation, who had told her about it anyway when the time came, because honesty mattered more to him than comfort. She had known men who were more charming. She had never known one she trusted more. The trading post in Laramie was busy on Monday mornings, ranchers and homesteaders coming in from the surrounding country for weekly supplies. Maren tied the horses at the rail and went inside and conducted the business she had come to conduct with the calm efficiency of someone who has learned that confidence is its own kind of protection. She posted the documents. She bought the thread and salt they needed. She spoke to the man behind the counter about the road conditions and the likelihood of further snow. She did not think about whether anyone was watching her or what they might be thinking. She had grown past that. On the way home, the road ran along the north bank of Sweetwater Creek for 2 miles, and she watched the frozen water through the bare cottonwoods and thought about the spring, about what the creek would look like when the ice went out and the water ran brown and cold over the smooth stones, about what the valley would look like with the aspens on the upper ridges going green. She had seen the valley only in winter. She wanted to see what it became when it was allowed to be something other than cold. She wanted to still be here to see it. That wanting had a particular quality to it, specific and certain, without the desperate edge that wanting had carried in Boston when she had been trying to want her way into a future that kept receding. This was different. This was the quiet wanting of someone who has already arrived somewhere and is simply hoping to remain. She drove the horses home through the cold afternoon and put them in the barn and went inside and said it's done, and wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and felt, for the first time since she had stepped onto the train in Boston with everything she owned in a small carpet bag, completely and simply at rest. The copies went to Laramie on a Monday morning. Maren drove the wagon herself. Callum had offered to go, and she had looked at him in the particular way she had when an offer was well meant but unnecessary, and he had stepped back and let her go. She was gone 4 hours. When she came back, she unhitched the horses, put them in the barn, came inside, hung up her coat, and sat down at the table. "It's done," she said. He set coffee in front of her. She wrapped both hands around the cup the way she had on that first night, and he noticed that, and he thought she probably did not know she did it, and he did not say anything about it. They did not speak of it again that day. There was nothing more to say. The thing was sent. What happened next would happen on its own timeline, in a courthouse in Cheyenne, in the offices of Aldridge and Crane, in the slow machinery of a legal system that moved at the pace of paperwork rather than urgency. They had done what they could do. Now they waited. Waiting was its own kind of work. January came in cold and clear, the kind of cold that has abandoned drama and settled into pure intention. The days were short, and the light was thin and blue, and the valley lay under its snow with the particular stillness of a place that has accepted what the season requires of it. Callum noticed things changing between them that he did not have precise language for. Not the large things, those had changed weeks ago, but the small ones, the ones that accumulate the way snow accumulates, each flake inconsequential and the total of them significant. The way she had stopped asking permission to use things in the kitchen and simply used them, which was not presumption, but ease. The way he had started leaving the lamp turned up when he went out to the barn in the evenings, because she was working at the table and the lamp was for her, without having made a decision about it. The way they had begun to speak less in the evenings and to be comfortable in that quiet, which is the truest indicator of something, though he could not have said with precision of what. He had not touched her since the night of the worst cold. He had not tried to. There was something in the restraint itself that felt important, like the difference between a thing chosen and a thing that simply happens. And he wanted what was between them to be chosen. She had not touched him either, but he had seen her watching his hands when he worked, the way a person watches something they are trying to understand through observation, and he had felt the weight of that attention, the way you feel warmth from a fire you are not standing directly in front of. One morning in the second week of January, she told him what she had not told him before. She told him about her husband. His name had been Patrick Donahue, she said. He had been a bookkeeper, quiet and careful, a man who was better with numbers than with people, and who had known it and had found in Maren someone who understood both and did not make him feel diminished by the difference. They had been married 4 years. They had been content, which she said without apology, understanding that content was not a lesser thing, but a different one. He had died of a fever in the winter of 1881, quickly, the way those fevers sometimes take people, leaving her with a rented house full of his belongings and a set of accounts that showed he had been quietly borrowing against his salary for 2 years to cover losses she had not known about, because he had been ashamed to tell her. The house went. The savings went. She had kept her position at the law office for another year, long enough to understand that the position was not going to become what she needed it to become. Not for a woman, not in Boston in 1882, no matter how well she did the work. She told all of this sitting at the table in the morning light with her hands flat on the wood in front of her, the way a person presents something they have decided to stop carrying alone. Callum listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You've been taking care of things by yourself for a long time," he said. "Yes." She looked at her hands. "I had gotten used to it. And then Harlan Voss made you a set of promises. And then I was foolish enough to believe them." "You were not foolish," he said, and the steadiness in his voice on those 4 words was absolute, the steadiness of a man stating a fact he will not allow to be revised. "You were a woman with limited options, who read a set of letters, written specifically to be believed, and made a reasonable decision based on the available information. That is not foolishness. That is exactly the kind of thinking you do better than anyone I have ever met." She looked at him. Her eyes were very bright, not with tears, but with something else, the brightness of a person who has received something they needed and did not expect. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The stove breathed. The light moved across the floor. Outside, the valley held itself in its winter silence. Then Callum stood up and went to the desk and opened the drawer and took out the letter, the one that had been there since November, the one with her name in Harlan's handwriting. He set it on the table. He sat back down and looked at her and told her about it. All of it. The letter's arrival 3 weeks before the blizzard. His decision to put it in the drawer without acting on it. His failure, in the days after she arrived, to tell her it existed. The reasons he had given himself, that he was waiting to understand it better, that the moment had not been right, that he needed to think about what it meant, all of which were true, and none of which were the whole truth. The whole truth was simpler and harder than any of those reasons. He had not told her because he had not wanted to introduce any uncertainty into the fact of her being there. He had wanted her to stay, and he had used his silence to improve the odds of it, and he was not proud of that. She read the letter. She set it down. She was quiet for a long time. "You knew I was coming," she said. "Yes." "And when I arrived, you said nothing." "Yes." She looked at the letter again, then at him. He held her gaze because she deserved that, deserved to see his face plainly, while she decided what she thought of what he had just told her. "Why are you telling me now?" she asked. "Because I should have told you the first morning," he said. "And because whatever happens next, I want it built on what's true." The silence that followed was different from other silences between them. It had an edge to it, not anger exactly, but the particular quality of someone reorganizing their understanding of something that matters, finding the new shape of it, testing whether it holds. "I'm not leaving," she said finally. "I know. But I want you to understand that I would have stayed regardless. She looked at him steadily. Not because I had nowhere else to go. Because I chose to. I know that too, he said. Now. Something settled between them. Not resolved, not entirely, but placed in its proper position where it could be seen clearly and moved forward from. He reached across the table and picked up the letter and put it in the stove. She watched it burn. Then she looked at him, and the edge in her eyes had gone. And what was there instead was something that had no clean name, but that he recognized. The way you recognize something you have been waiting for long enough that you had stopped expecting it. He reached for her hand across the table, his palm against her fingers, rough and warm and careful. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed that way for a while, in the winter morning light, not speaking, the stove burning quietly between them, the valley white and enormous outside the frost-edged window. Then Callum said, "I think we should get married." She looked at him, not surprised. "Ask me properly," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maren Donahue, I would like to spend the rest of my life with someone who corrects my ledgers and saves young men's arms and refuses to go to Denver when I tell her to, if you're willing." She considered it with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm willing," she said. They told Reverend Holt the following Sunday. He looked at them both for a long moment with the expression of a man who has watched something develop that he is genuinely glad to have witnessed. "January 30th, he suggested, "the Cottonwood Grove by the creek." "Outside," Callum said. "Outside," Maren agreed. The night before the wedding, Callum came in late from the barn, later than usual, and found Maren sitting at the table with the lamp low and the ring in her hand, turning it slowly in the light. She set it down when he came in and looked up, and there was something in her face that was neither fear nor doubt, but the particular seriousness of a person who is about to do something permanent and is honoring the weight of it. He sat down across from her. "Second thoughts?" he asked. "No," she said. "Just thoughts." She looked at the ring. "I want to know that I'm walking into this because it's what I want, not because of what happened in Boston or what happened at the Laramie station, not because of Harlan Voss." She looked at him. "You understand the difference?" "Yes," he said. "I do." "Then I have no second thoughts," she said. She pushed the ring across the table to him. "Give it to me tomorrow, in front of everyone." He picked it up. He held it in his closed fist for a moment. "In front of everyone," he agreed. He did not sleep that night, not from anxiety, but from a kind of fullness, the sense of a life that had been emptied out and had been, without his entirely noticing the process, filled back up with something different from what it had held before, but solid and real and his. The morning of January 30th came in clear and cold and blue, the sky above the Sweetwater Valley the particular color of winter sky that looks like it has been polished. Maren, dressed in her mother's blue dress, the one she had mended so many times, the thread had created its own quiet pattern across the fabric. She wore her hair up, simply, with 2 pins she had brought from Boston. She looked in the small mirror above the wash basin, and what looked back at her was not what had looked back at her in Boston, or at the Laramie station, or on that first night, wrapped in a borrowed flannel shirt in front of a stranger's stove. What looked back at her was someone who had made it through. Callum wore his best shirt, dark wool, pressed with the flat iron Maren had heated on the stove. He had polished his boots as much as old leather would allow, which was imperfectly and genuinely. He stood on the porch waiting for her, and when she came out, he looked at her for a long moment without speaking. And whatever he saw, he kept to himself in the way he kept most things, privately and completely. They drove the wagon to the cottonwood grove. The valley had come. Tom Garrett and his wife and daughters, Edith Granger in her good coat with young Nell beside her, Danny Marsh, his arm still in its sling, standing straight and determined at the edge of the gathering. Neighbors Callum had known for years, and a few he barely knew, drawn by the particular human impulse toward a thing that promises to be real rather than performed. Reverend Holt stood beneath the largest cottonwood, its bare branches silver gray against the blue sky, and he read the words that he read at all weddings, but that sounded in this cold, clear air by this frozen creek like they were being said for the first time. Callum took Maren's hand. "Do you take this woman?" He looked at her. "I do," he said, before the wind could have the words. "Do you take this man?" "I do," she said, just as steady. The ring went on her finger. It fit the way things fit when they have been waiting in the right place for the right moment. Someone in the crowd whooped. Children laughed. Edith Granger said something quietly to Nell that made the girl smile. Tables of food stretched along the creek bank, covered with cloths against the cold. Neighbors' contributions, cornbread and preserved things, and 2 pies that had somehow survived the wagon ride intact. For the first time since November, the valley felt like it was breathing freely. Then someone shouted fire. The sound of it cut through everything. Not a word that has to be translated or interpreted. Fire. Everyone understood it the same way at the same moment, the way the body understands it before the mind does. The hay barn was already gone. Not going. Gone. The fire had taken the dry winter hay first, the entire season's reserve, and from there it had moved with the speed and efficiency of fire in a dry structure, consuming everything in its path with a completeness that left nothing gradual about it. The roof was already falling in on itself, the walls leaning, the smoke pouring upward into the blue sky in a column that could be seen from the north end of the valley. Callum moved before anyone finished understanding what they were seeing. "Bucket line," he called out, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd with the authority of a man who knows exactly what needs to happen and does not waste time on the panic before it. Men formed the chain from the creek, the water cold enough to numb hands through gloves, and they worked it with the grim efficiency of people who understand that some things can be saved and some cannot, and the only sensible course is to save what you can. Maren had a shovel in her hands before she had fully decided to pick one up. She went to work on the fire break, cutting a line through the dead grass between the barn and the cabin with the focused urgency of someone who has identified the one thing that matters and is doing it. Her wedding dress caught on the frozen ground and tore at the hem, and she did not notice it or noticed it and did not care. The cold air tasted of smoke. Her eyes watered. She kept the shovel moving. The women beat at the sparks with wet blankets where the wind carried them toward the cabin roof. Edith Granger worked beside Maren without being asked, her coat black at the cuffs with char, her expression the particular expression of a woman who has faced worse and survived it. The barn fell. The sound of it was enormous, and then it was over. A great settling of burning timber that sent a column of sparks up into the blue air like something released. The cabin held. The fire break held. The bucket line held barely until the thing had burned itself down to nothing it could continue to consume. In the aftermath, the smell of smoke was everywhere, and the cold had a different quality to it. The cold of air that has recently held fire. and the valley stood in the silence of people who have just done something difficult together and are still in the process of returning to themselves. Sheriff Decker appeared on horseback at the edge of the creek road. Beside him, in irons, was a man named Wes Coulter, one of Harlan's hired hands, a young man with a reckless face and the look of someone who had done what he had been told without thinking as far forward as consequences. He had been caught on the south side of the barn with a torch still in his hand by two of the Garrett hands who had come back for a forgotten coat. The evidence was simple and complete. Harlan Voss arrived 20 minutes later. He came at a walk, not a run, which was a choice, and everyone present understood it as one. He was dressed well, as always, his coat immaculate, his gloves clean. He looked at the ruin of the barn with an expression of practiced condolence that did not reach his eyes. "Shame about your barn, Devrett," he said. "These things happen in winter." Maren walked toward him. She walked across the charred ground in her torn blue wedding dress, her face black with smoke, the shovel still in her hand, and she stopped at the side of his horse and looked up at him. Around them, the valley had gone very still. Tom Garrett, Edith Granger, Danny Marsh with his sling, Reverend Holt with ash on his good coat, all of them watching. Harlan looked down at her with the particular expression of a man who is about to say something dismissive to a woman he considers defeated. She spoke before he could. "Aldridge and Crane received the documents 10 days ago," she said. Her voice was completely level, not loud, not performing for the crowd, but not excluding them either, carrying exactly as far as it needed to carry. Every forged signature, every fraudulent transfer, the railroad survey records going back to 1879, the complete timeline of how you have been acquiring land along Sweetwater Creek from people who did not understand what it would be worth. She looked up at him steadily. "If anything happens to anyone standing on this property today, that information is already in the hands of the court. Your name is already in the file. There is nothing left for you to prevent." Harlan looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running the calculation behind his eyes, the way he always ran calculations, testing for the variable he had not accounted for, checking whether she was presenting a position or a fact. He could not determine which it was. That uncertainty was everything. "You're bluffing," he said, quietly, not for the crowd, for her. "Am I?" she said. Not a question. Decker moved his horse forward. "Harlan Voss," he said, "I think you'd better come with me." Harlan did not look at Decker. He looked at Maren for another long moment, and in that moment something shifted in his face. Not remorse. He was not built for remorse, but the specific expression of a man who has encountered something he genuinely did not anticipate and is making the first adjustments to a worldview he has held without revision for a very long time. "You chose wrong," he said to her. The same words as before, in a different register. Not a threat anymore. Something closer to bewilderment. "No," she said. "For the first time in a long time, I chose exactly right." He looked at Callum. Callum said nothing. He had nothing to add. Harlan Voss turned his horse and rode with Decker back down the valley road, and the sound of the hooves diminished and then disappeared around the bend, and what remained was the smell of smoke, and the cold, and the creek running under its ice, and the people of Sweetwater Valley standing in the ruins of a barn that had been standing that morning. Callum came to stand beside her. He looked at the ruin, 2 seasons of hay reserves, 2 good cattle lost in the initial blaze, the structure itself, which had taken 3 weeks to build and had stood for 11 years. She looked at his face, not at the barn. "We can rebuild," he said. "We will," she said, not as comfort, as a statement of fact, the way she stated all facts. He looked down at her. She was black with smoke, and her dress was torn, and she was holding a shovel in her wedding dress, and she was the most precisely herself she had ever been in all the weeks he had known her, entirely without performance, entirely present, entirely real. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him. Behind them, the valley began the slow work of returning to itself, of collecting what was salvageable and setting aside what was not, and understanding the difference, which is the oldest and most necessary human skill. That night, the smoke smell had settled into the cabin walls, and the cold pressed in hard, and the lamp burned low. Callum sat on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. Maren sat beside him, close enough that her shoulder was against his. She did not speak. She waited. When it came the way things come in men who have held them too long, not gradually, but all at once, the way a frozen river breaks in spring, with a sound and a force that makes it clear that the holding had always been temporary, that the thaw had always been inevitable. He wept, not the single-tear restraint of a man performing grief, but the real thing, the kind that has no dignity in it and does not ask for any, shaking and absolute. He wept for Ruth, who had deserved better than dying while he moved cattle 3 days north, for Nora, who had not had the chance to grow in difficult ground, for 4 years of mornings alone and evenings alone, and the specific, accumulated weight of a life lived without anyone to hand a coffee cup to. Maren put her arms around him. She held him without speaking, because there were no words available that were not smaller than what the moment contained. She held him, and she let it be what it was, and she did not try to make it end before it was finished. When it was finished, he sat up. He breathed. He was, she could see, embarrassed, the reflexive embarrassment of a man who has been taught that this kind of release is not permissible. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't be sorry for that." He looked at her. His face was entirely open in a way she had not seen it before, stripped of all the careful reserve, all the measured distance, just the face of a man who has been seen and knows it. "I've been holding that for a long time," he said. "I know," she said. "You don't have to hold it alone anymore." Outside the Sweetwater Creek ran its dark course beneath the ice, patient and steady and going where it was always going, and the stars above the valley were very cold and very clear, and inside the cabin 2 people sat together in the ruins of a difficult day and let the night hold them in its enormous, indifferent quiet. And that was enough. For tonight, that was entirely enough. Spring came to Sweetwater Valley the way it always came, without asking permission. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, uncovering the pale dead grass beneath, and then the grass began, slowly, to consider the possibility of green. The creek rose with the melt and ran loud and brown for 2 weeks, before it settled back into its clear, patient self over the smooth stones. The cottonwood trees along the bank put out their first small leaves, tentative and bright, the color of something that has decided to try again. The new barn went up in March. It took 4 days and the labor of 11 men from up and down the valley, Tom Garrett and his 2 sons, Perch from Edith Granger's place, Danny Marsh with his healed arm swinging a hammer with the particular enthusiasm of someone proving a point, and others Callum had known for years, and a few he was still in the process of knowing. They came with tools and timber and opinions about the proper way to seat a roof beam, and Maren fed them all at the long table she and Edith Granger set up outside in the thin March sunshine, cornbread and bean soup, and the dried apple cake that had become, without formal announcement, the thing people expected when they came to the Devrett place. On the last evening, when the final beam was in, and the men had gone home, and the new structure stood clean and pale against the darkening sky, Callum walked through it alone. He stood in the center of the empty space and looked up at the new roof, at the clean lines of the timber work, and he felt something that was neither the absence of grief nor the pretense that loss had not occurred, but something more accurate than either. The understanding that what is built after loss can be solid, that it does not have to apologize for coming after. Maren was waiting on the porch when he came back across the yard. She handed him coffee without being asked. He stood beside her, and they looked at the barn together in the last light. "It's good work," she said. "It is," he agreed. In September of 1884, the letter came from Aldridge and Crane. Maren read it at the table, twice, carefully, before she said anything. Then she set it down and looked at Callum across the kitchen. "The court found in your favor," she said. "All fraudulent transfers declared void. The East Bank parcel and the creek strip are returned to this property." She paused. "Harlan Voss is ordered to pay court costs and damages." Callum stood very still. He looked at the letter from across the room. Then he came to the table and picked it up and read it himself, all the way through. In the slow and thorough way he read everything that mattered. He set it down. He looked at Maren. She was watching him with the particular stillness of someone who understands that a moment is happening and does not want to interrupt it. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. "You had the land worth fighting for. I had the patience to document why." He looked at the letter one more time. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the desk drawer, in the place where Harlan's letter had once been, and closed the drawer, and that was the end of that. The railroad came through the valley in the spring of 1885. It cut through the eastern edge of the Voss property, reduced now and legally circumscribed, and it bypassed the Devrett land entirely, which suited Callum exactly. He had not wanted the railroad on his property. He had wanted the land to remain what it was, which was his, and a ranch and home. Emma was born in the summer of 1886. She arrived in July, fierce and loud, and entirely certain of her own importance from the first moment, which Maren said was appropriate, and Callum said was unsurprising. Edith Granger came and stayed 3 days, as a matter of course, and without being asked, and Danny Marsh appeared at the door the following morning with a carved wooden horse he had made himself, somewhat lopsided but clearly a horse, and stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and the expression of a young man who is not sure of the protocol, but is certain of the feeling. Callum let him in. They sat at the table and drank coffee while Maren nursed the baby in the room beyond, and Danny talked about the girl in Cheyenne, whose name was Annette, and whom he was going back to in the spring. And Callum listened and did not say much, but what he said was worth the listening. Thomas came in 1888 in October, smaller and quieter than his sister had been, arriving in the world with the air of someone who has considered the situation and decided to proceed carefully. He had his father's eyes and his mother's hands, and he watched things before he touched them, and he did not speak his first word until he was ready to say it correctly. The schoolhouse was built in the autumn of 1887 on the north side of town on a piece of ground the community had agreed to set aside for the purpose. It was Maren's doing, though she would not have described it that way. She would have said it was the valley's doing, that she had simply been present at enough kitchen tables and church hall mornings to understand what was needed, and to say so clearly enough that the people with the resources to build it could see it too. She taught there 5 mornings a week. By the second year, she had more students than the building was comfortable with, and by the third year, there was talk of adding a second room, which happened in 1889 with lumber donated by Tom Garrett and labor donated by everyone else. It was the autumn of 1889 when the black carriage came down the valley road. Maren saw it first from the schoolhouse window. She recognized the lawyer who stepped down first, a man from Cheyenne she had met once in the offices of Aldridge and Crane. Then the second figure, slower, needing the lawyer's arm to manage the step down from the carriage. Harlan Voss was 63 years old, and he looked older than that. The broad chest had narrowed. The face that had been hard and certain had become something else, not soft. Harlan Voss would never be soft, but less certain. The cane he used was a plain one, not chosen for appearance. His coat was still good wool, but it hung differently on him than it had. He stood in the road outside the schoolhouse and waited. Maren came out. She stood on the step and looked at him in the autumn afternoon, the sound of children's voices coming through the window behind her, and she felt, with some surprise, that what she felt was very little of what she might have expected to feel. Not anger, not the old tightened quality of a wound that has been pressed. Something quieter. The particular feeling of a person who has been through something and has come out the other side far enough that the thing itself has stopped defining the view. "Miss Donahue," he said. Then, correcting himself, "Mrs. Devrett." "Mr. Voss," she said. He did not dress it up. Whatever else he had become in the years since the courthouse had taken apart the careful architecture of his holdings, he had apparently given up the performance of ease. "I'm dying," he said, simply as a matter of fact. "The doctor in Cheyenne gives me until spring, perhaps." He did not ask for sympathy, and she did not offer it in the ways that would have felt false. She nodded. He continued. "I have made provisions for certain things," he said. "One of them is this." The lawyer produced a document and a bank draft. The document outlined a donation to the Sweetwater Valley School, sufficient to purchase books and materials for 5 years. The amount on the draft was specific and not small. Maren looked at the draft. She looked at Harlan. "This is for the children," she said. "Not for you." "I understand that," he said. "The school board will decide whether to accept it." "I understand that as well." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze, which cost him something. She could see that. And she did not make it easier than it was, because making it easier would have been dishonest. And dishonesty was not something she had ever had patience for. "The school board meets Thursday," she said. "I'll present it to them." He nodded. He turned to go back to the carriage, slower than he had come, leaning on the cane and the lawyer's arm. "Mr. Voss," she said. He turned. She had thought about what she wanted to say for a long time, without knowing she was thinking about it, the way you work through a set of figures in the back of your mind and arrive at the answer before you have consciously begun. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said. "Not for your sake, for mine. I didn't want to carry it." She looked at him steadily. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for before spring." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face that did not quite become an expression and then was gone. "Thank you," he said. And meant it, she thought, as much as Harlan Voss meant anything by then. The school board accepted the donation on Thursday for the children, as she had said, and the new books arrived before Christmas. Harlan Voss died in February of 1890. Maren heard it from Decker, who told Callum, who told her that evening at the table. She sat with it for a moment. Then she got up and put another log on the fire and came back and picked up her mending. That was all there was to say about it. On an evening in October of 1889, before the first snow, Callum and Maren sat on the porch of the house that had grown from 1 room to 4, without their quite noticing when each addition had become necessary. The porch ran the full width of the front now, wide enough for 2 chairs and a small table between them, which was all they needed. Emma was in the yard below, 7 years old, attempting to teach Thomas, who was 1 year old and not quite walking steadily yet, the proper technique for throwing a pine cone, which Thomas was approaching with the careful deliberation of a person who intends to do a thing correctly before doing it at all. The creek ran in the distance, just audible. The cottonwood trees along its bank had gone gold, the way they went every October, the color so clean and specific it looked almost unreasonable against the blue of the afternoon sky. "Do you ever wonder," Maren said, not looking away from the children, "what would have happened if Harlan had not left me at that crossroads?" Callum was quiet for a moment, a long one. "No," he said. She turned to look at him. "This is what happened," he said. He looked at her in the particular way he had looked at her more and more over the years, directly and without reservation, the way a man looks at something he chose and would choose again. "I don't spend much time on the other versions." She leaned into him. His arm came around her shoulders. They sat in the easy warmth of it, the specific comfort of 2 people who have been through enough together that sitting quietly has stopped being silence and become something more like a conversation in a language they have built between them over time. Below them, Emma had given up on teaching Thomas and was now throwing pine cones herself with considerable accuracy at a fence post which she had announced she would hit 5 times in a row and which she was going to hit 5 times in a row because she was Emma Devrett, and she did not announce things she did not intend to do. Thomas watched her with his careful eyes, and then bent down, steadied himself with one hand on the ground, and picked up a pine cone of his own, and held it, and looked at it, and did not throw it yet. Inside the cabin that had become a house, on the shelf by the lamp, a pair of small red shoes sat beside a pair of tiny soft leather shoes, and between them the ring caught the last of the afternoon light and held it. On the table below the shelf, a sewing kit and a carving knife and a ledger with numbers in 2 different hands, built side by side. On the top shelf, a Bible with 2 names crossed out in old ink, and below them, in Maren's precise small handwriting, 2 new names and 2 new dates. The creek ran on. The cottonwoods turned. The smoke from the chimney went up into the cold, clear air of the October evening, and dispersed, and was gone. And in the yard below the porch, Thomas Devrett finally threw his pine cone. It went wide and low, and landed in the grass 3 feet from the fence post. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he went and picked it up, and came back to his spot, and looked at the post, and threw it again. Maren watched him, and felt something she had no single word for, the layered feeling of a life that has been built piece by piece from difficult materials, and has turned out, in the end, to be exactly what she would have chosen if she had known enough at the beginning to choose it. She had not known. She had only moved forward, one step at a time, through blizzard and betrayal and loss, through a stranger's door and a borrowed flannel shirt and a lamp turned up for her in the evenings, and a ring placed on a shelf where she could see it was waiting. That door had opened once to save a life. It had stayed open to build one. And every morning after, as long as the creek kept singing and the sun kept coming up over the Sweetwater Valley, they chose each other again. Not because of a storm, not because of Harlan Voss, because of everything that had come after, everything they had built together from whatever the storm had left behind. Because love made from kindness lasts longer than fire, and they both knew it now.